Welcome to the Rocks Back Pages podcast. I'm Barney Hoskins, and I'm connected remotely to my colleagues Mark Pringle.
Hi, Barney.
Martin Collier.
Hi, Barney.
And Jasper Murison Bowie.
Hello, Barney.
Also on our screens today is our very special guest, Tony Russell. Hi, Tony.
Hello, everyone.
Hi. Hi.
Later, we'll be talking about Gillian Welch and the Everlys brothers and Bunny Wailer and other things. But right now, it's just wonderful to welcome one of the great writers on classic blues and country music and the author of several superb books, including Rural Rhythm, published this month by Oxford University Press. Tony, we've had your work on Rocks Back Pages for some years now. We're very grateful for that. Tell us how you first came to write about American roots music in the early 70s, or maybe even earlier than that. How did you stumble on this incredible music in the first place?
Okay, it's the early to mid-60s. I'm in my mid-teens, and I'm listening, as we did, to popular music. My head, always wedged against a tinny speaker to pick up Radio Luxembourg, and it's borne in on me. I find all this stuff fascinating, the whole world of pop music. I mean, not the artists, the record labels, the stuff in small italics underneath the song, which it took me a long time to realize was giving you the name of the songwriter. All these little details about records, the objects themselves fascinated me. And I bought the pop press. And so I'm reading about the stuff, I'm listening to it. And I come to realize through both of these media that what I'm really interested in is what gets through to me most penetratingly is Black American music of the kind that was then generally called R&B. And so I'm talking about things like the early Tamla Motown artists and Stax figures. Those you could hear occasionally on British radio. You very seldom heard the people that I then became particularly interested in, which was the Chicago blues musicians like Muddy Waters and Howling Wolf and Jimmy Reed. They were almost inaccessible. And so that was part of the charm, really. You read about them in the pop papers, or at least you read about them in Record Mirror. New Record Mirror was much the most avant-garde of these papers in those days for me.
Norman Joplin. I
once, years later, when he was acting as a publicist for some record company, and he called me as a publicist for another, and he introduced himself, and I was incoherent with fan worship. Because I said, you're responsible for my sitting here. You turned me on to all these people. I realize now, and I'm sure Norman would agree, if you look back at them, the pieces are nothing special. He used to write, there was a series called The Great Unknowns, yes, which gives you some notion of how these people were regarded. These were people who were making a perfectly good living in Chicago and elsewhere, but they were great unknowns to the New Record Mirror. It might be a piece on Howling Wolf, say, and it would be a couple of paragraphs cobbled from album sleeve notes and a list of singles currently available that have been culled from some American catalogue. But there's this guy called Howling Wolf, and he comes from Mississippi, and he's been in Memphis and Chicago, and he's done songs called Killing Floor and Do the Do and Smokestack Lightning. What is this stuff? I mean, this is so absolutely not Dickie Valentine and Lita Rosa. This is music. I can't even get a sense of what it must sound like because nobody is ever playing it. So all I can do is read about it and kind of slaver slightly at the mouth. But then, fortunately, for once, the record industry came to my aid, and they started putting out some of this hardline R&B stuff in Britain. There was Pi with the International R&B series. With
Guy Stevens.
Guy Stevens was another, yes, with Sue Records. And he also wrote for Record Mirror.
Exactly. Wrote about Sue Records' products for Record Mirror.
He was another mentor in the early days. Anyway, so Pi shows up with these red and yellow labelled Chuck Berry and Bo Diddley and Howling Wolf and Sonny Boy Williamson. EMI retaliates by slipping some of the product from the Chicago label VJ by Jimmy Reed and John Lee Hooker onto the stateside label. And so this stuff is beginning to come out. And then, greatly daring, I would order an album of an American import label of old blues recordings by Charlie Patton and Son House and Skip James. And that was another mind-blowing moment, hearing these lost voices from 30 or 40 years beforehand. So there's all this huge learning curve for me, not a learning curve, a learning mountain, as every month I'm getting a copy of Blues Unlimited or R&B Monthly and finding out about these people who, as I say, very often I knew about them before I knew what they sounded like. But that was intriguing and interesting and a great encouragement to further research. It's a common plaint these days, but when you can get anything at the touch of a keyboard stroke, the fun goes out of it and the sense of achievement and discovery. But anyway, I was listening to this stuff and becoming for several years a complete blues obsessive. And then at university, I met somebody who listened to blues, but also had records of American old-time country music, and especially the famous Harry Smith anthology. And that, for me, was a genuine Damascene moment. You know, I've been used to listening to old crackly old blues records, and now here's crackly old hillbilly records alongside them on the same compilation. That was one of the great points about the Harry Smith collection. There were no barriers. And it was as if I no longer had to think of music in terms of two distinct communities, of black music over here and white music over here. I could now feel that I was walking down any southern town, Main Street, and hearing black music from one side and white music on the other maybe, but it was mingling and merging in the air around me, and I was walking through this wonderful miasma of southern vernacular music. And that, for me, was a moment of excitement and discovery that I hope I have never lost the spirit of.
Going to build me a log cabin on a mountain so high so I can.
I'm wondering, we'll obviously talk about rural rhythms greater length in a moment, but I'm about halfway through it. And one thing that strikes me is that the recording crew who have come down from New York or Chicago, wherever, down to whichever southern town it is, would be recording one of the blues men in the morning and one of the old-time or proto-country acts in the afternoon of the same day. That actually what you're talking about, the black music and the white music, was being recorded by the same people at the same time frequently.
Yes, and on some occasions we do have accounts that suggest that there was a certain amount of interracial jamming outside while people were waiting to be recorded.
Amazing.
Or of kind of listening in to see what the other lot are doing and maybe stealing a little of it. There are many things that one wishes one could have a time machine for, but to be in Atlanta in 1929 listening to Gid Tanner and the Skillet Lickers perform and then give way to Barbecue Bob.
Yeah.
I mean, that would have been something.
It is fascinating that because, old-time country music, old-time music has that in its name, old time, and it's very much a time capsule. Reading your book, you're going back mostly 2/3 of the records you say are from a 7-year period, 1922 to 1929, and that's not necessarily true of the genres blues and jazz that continued and carried on in perhaps what seems from the outside looking in a more direct way, although of course country then came out of old time music. But how do you view old-time country music compared to the blues? You're talking about how they're kind of mingling in the air as you listen to them, but how do you make that comparison? How do you feel one compared to the other?
Well, it's perfectly true that old-time music was marketed as old-time from the start by the record companies in their press releases. The whole idea was that by buying an old-time a record of Gid Tanner and the Skillet Lickers, say, or Uncle Dave Macon or Charlie Poole, by doing that you were essentially connecting with the music of your parents or even grandparents. This is not, on the whole, what you get in the contemporary advertising for blues. Blues does not look back. Blues is a very unnostalgic music. So you would think that was a huge difference between the two, and it is true that many old-time country songs are inconceivable as sung by black people, at any rate by black people who were actually listening to and caring about the words, because they don't express things that black people were interested in expressing. And I make this point about the very first record I write about in the book, Little Old Log Cabin in the Lane. It's all very well for Fiddling John Carson and his audience to be nostalgic about Little Old Log Cabin in the Lane. But, the black people of the time would have been only too glad to have got out of the Little Old Log Cabin in the Lane, even if it was to exchange it, for a sharecropper's shack down some other lane. But blues is about moving on, whereas hillbilly music is very often about staying in place. And so that is an important distinction. And yet, all the time you sense, especially with the more creative of the recorded musicians, this desire to not be stereotyped as recreators of good old days. They're looking to progress the music and their own careers with it, no doubt. But a lot of these people were not content to be put in the enclosure marked old time, and they burst out of it as soon as they could.
That's interesting. And because one of the reviews or an article, a contemporary article of the time talking about it, you quote as saying, "The death of Floyd Collins, Wreck of the Shenandoah, At My Mother's Grave, and other such songs which have had fairly widespread popularity may mark the initial move in the passing of jazz," which of course retrospectively is a very amusing thought, that somehow these old-time records might mark the passing of jazz, which of course then went on to become the predominant form of popular music in the 30s and 40s and continues to be a performed form of music now. So it's funny, but it makes sense what you say, that some people did see it as a boat that they could take onwards rather than just looking backwards.
And two, it's true that old-timey music was enlisted in the war against progress, essentially, which jazz represented. It represented progress. It represented the possibly danger. Well, it represented urbanization, the possibly risky presence of a more emancipated African American population, loose morals. It represented all kinds of things, and constantly we're having these old hillbilly barn dance tunes being held up as representative of the true spirit of America.
A weapon in the culture war, absolutely.
As against this suspicious, rather black, possibly even Jewish music, which is jazz.
Tell me, how much... I mean, I get the impression that the Great Depression sort of stopped both rural blues and rural white music in its tracks as a recording form. Is there any truth in that?
No, well, yes. I mean, it's a simple economic fact that it did. I mean, that by about 1932, 33, 34, almost no recording, compared with the amount done in previous years, was being done anymore. Of course, it's always a mistake to assume that people that we know on records only made their living by making records. Yeah. If they were musicians, they might have had day jobs as musicians, and more likely they didn't, and they didn't stop playing. What's interesting is that you do get this kind of extended hiccup, and then after 2 or 3 years of the worst of the Depression, the music business grinds back into business again with the cheap labels like Bluebird and Decca coming in at half the price of earlier records and bringing with them a whole raft of new artists. And the music doesn't immediately change, but it starts to be aware of everything else around it in a way that earlier musicians weren't always. And so you hear the rhythm, the rural rhythm, becoming urbanized. It becomes more of an urban rhythm, and music gets faster, it gets more demonstrative, more showy, and then you end up with bluegrass, which is a kind of old-timey super music, so to speak.
Yes.
It's a super head music.
And also, in the book, you write about bands who were using ragtime, and they became sort of proto-Western swing bands to some extent, the Texan music.
Western swing musicians were probably the first generation of people that really listened hard to records for their inspiration, because they were stuck in Texas and Oklahoma, surrounded by people that wanted to hear fiddle band music for dances, but they were men in their teens and 20s who wanted to play music like the music that they were listening to in the record stores of Dallas and Houston and Fort Worth, which was black and white jazz and some black blues. And they were excited and inspired by this music. As I don't think you can find any similar example anywhere else of people who so clearly just set themselves a project. We want to play jazz, essentially, jazz and blues, but we want to do it with hillbilly instruments, so to speak, in a hillbilly setting, so to speak. And so you come up with this, one of the first great fusion musics, which is Western swing, which is Western and swing and blues and everything.
I mean, it's interesting, the chapter on Jimmy Rogers, you described that as being genuinely new insofar as that his verbal concerns, his musical concerns were closely cribbed to some extent from black blues that he had obviously listened to all his life. But there's a sort of straight line through from Jimmy Rogers to Hank Williams to Elvis Presley of this notion of white musicians in the South being very aware and appreciative of black music.
Yes, that's true. And that Rogers, Hank Williams line, including people like Lefty Frizzell and all sorts of other people, essentially is what's behind Merle Haggard and Willie Nelson. That represents one of the two, that's one leg of the, so to speak, of the great dichotomy in country music, which is, on the one hand, you have that tradition, on the other hand, you have the family music tradition of the Carter family, which descends through many other family groups to bluegrass, which is essentially based on that aspect of country music. And so it's very interesting because it stands for two entirely different characteristics. The family group, I think I once described this. You imagine listening to the Carter family of a group of people standing soberly dressed, standing around a little portable organ or something like that in a parlor, and the light is filtering through the curtains on this scene of domestic quiet and serenity. Whereas Jimmy Rogers is the man who says, anywhere I hang my hat is home, sweet home to me. It's the music of the rounder, the atomized 20th century human being on the road. You can't pin me down. It's an entirely other tradition, and it's wonderful. Country music, I think, has been sustained for generations now by the tension between these two kinds, which split essentially at that famous Bristol, Tennessee recording session in 1927, when both Jimmy Rogers and the Carter family were discovered and made their first recordings.
Amazing.
And you, looking with hindsight, you can see that essentially just creates the bifurcation of country music right there.
It's fantastic.
T for Texas, T for Tennessee. T for Texas, T for Tennessee. T for Thelma, that gal that made a wreck out of me.
Am I right in thinking that your book ends on number 78 of your 78 records?
Yes, it was a cunning. Actually,
we saw what you did there, Tony.
Yes.
Well, I originally was cribbing even more blatantly from Neil McGregor. I was going to have the history of old-time country music in 100 records, but it was too big a book for the publisher. So I thought, what's the next number down from 100? Which
has resonance.
Has resonance, exactly, yes. So, yes, I'm sorry. Anyway, Martin, you were saying.
No, it's just interesting so that's the point where Bob Wills comes into the picture. And
yes, it seemed like a good place to end because it wasn't until I came to write that last paragraph of the book, really, that I realized in something like 16 and a half years, country music has gone from fiddling John Carson, scratching out a tune solo with just a fiddle, to the massed orchestra of Western jazz musicians that Bob Wills is at the head of. And everything else has moved a pace along with it. Everything, movies, books, everything about American life is racing at a similar tempo. And this is, it's hard to imagine Bob Wills and fiddling John Carson existing in the same time frame. They both lived at the same time, and yet the music has made such advances. But, the same is true of jazz, and the same is true of blues. It's just the country music has got such a reputation for staying the same that I thought a corrective draft should be administered here.
Actually, on the subject of it staying the same, I mean, the term old time or old-timey music, which was partly a marketing mechanism,
indeed,
but didn't it point to the fact that quite a few of those songs may have been in the repertoire of rural white musicians going right back 50 plus years, maybe back to the middle of the 19th century.
Oh, indeed. Yes. I mean, that was always held to be one of the great virtues of it. And this is the early press observations of these artists when they started performing in places where journalists would actually go, was that, good Lord, there's these people living down in Virginia and North Carolina and so forth, who are like sort of lost Shakespearean era Americans. And this was nourished by Cecil Sharp, having come, a decade or two beforehand, song collecting in the mountains and saying very much the same thing himself, which was culturally and linguistically true, but I don't know. I mean, I've imagined that a lot of people valued the age of the songs. A lot of the people who actually owned the songs valued the fact that they came from generations back, and it's very often part of the performance that you say, this is an old song. You will almost very, very often find musicians telling you how old they think a song is, very often, erring by centuries. But it's important that you give the song credibility and status by doing that. But again, for a lot of country musicians, they were impatient with that sort of thing. They wanted to move on to the next thing.
Tony, I wanted to read something from one of the three pieces that are going to feature on the homepage, because it speaks to the fact that you, not uniquely, but almost uniquely, write about old blues and old country records in ways that very few other writers have done. It's from, you wrote these two tremendous pieces in 2005, one about Uncle Dave Macon, who you've mentioned already, and one about Charlie Poole, who you also mentioned. They're sort of reviews of these two albums that came out in that year, compilations. And so you write, when I first encountered Charlie Poole, I knew hardly anything about old-time music. I was a blues fan, and my ears were tuned to the resonances of the slide guitar to men like Son House and Elmore James. I wasn't about to be seduced by some white guy with a banjo, but once I'd heard that crackly, cackly voice spinning me a line, I was hooked, lined, and sinkered. I love that.
Yeah, that's great.
Because it is, I mean, it's such a cliche, isn't it? But I mean, when you listen to some of the tracks that you write about in rural music, I mean, it has the same sort of keening edge to it that great old blues records do. When you listen to somebody like, I don't know, Frank Hutchison, it's not so, the experience isn't wildly different from listening to Robert Johnson.
No, exactly. And that was the one, I thought, important truth that I've been trying to write about, that I've been inspired by, that I've been trying to hammer into the heads of people who didn't want to hear it sometimes, for all my sort of writing life, is that forget about categories and racial divisions and so forth. There are some people who just do not fit the molds that you're using to try and fit them into. And there are some kinds of music that are mixed and multifarious, and get over yourselves. That's how it is.
Well, your very first book was Blacks, Whites and Blues, published in 1970, and you look far too young to have published a book that long ago. But that was an brown-nosing points.
That was an extended argument for what I was just saying. I just wanted to make this point. I mean, it's not a huge discovery. Other people had made it before. John Cohen had written a very good article in Sing Out some years earlier about the black-white folk music interchange. I mean, I wasn't onto some new discovery here, but the people I knew who were interested in blues were reluctant to hear that there was virtue in contemporary white music. I mean, contemporary with the recordings we were listening to, not with us ourselves. And as far as I knew, any country music fans, they had no interest in blues either. And I just wanted to kind of open their ears to the thought that maybe, if you like these guys, these other guys just over here are actually doing something quite similar, or interestingly, not quite the same, but, there are connections and associations, and don't you think it's interesting? And especially when you reflect on what kind of sometimes unimaginable social interactions might actually have made this possible. The circumstances in which Jimmy Rogers might actually have picked up songs, as some black contemporaries of his said he did, from them. I can't imagine what sort of a meeting that was. And I'm completely intrigued by the thought of how you negotiated this in the 1920s or 30s, fantastically tricky cross-racial movement to go and listen to the music of people that you don't associate with.
In a way, you were an early algorithm.
You are an algorithm.
I've not been called that before. Thank you. I think.
Interestingly, if you think of someone like in Charlie Rich's background, or in Jerry Lee Lewis or Elvis's, there's often a black figure
Almost invariably. You see, that's
we're
another...
We're going to be talking about the Everly brothers briefly in a moment, well, quite soon, in this podcast. And they famously were taught guitar by a black guy, local black guy. That's where they learnt their music from. So there's this one man who sat them down and showed them the chords and showed them how to do stuff. It's something which has never really gone away. Well, I suspect you get less of it today than you did back then.
Yes. Well, yes. Innocence is a very difficult word to use in this context, but there was a certain innocence around then that made some of these encounters and influences feasible and unself-conscious in a way that they would not be today.
One of the tricky elements of that dynamic, I think, though, is that, I mean, when you think we've been talking about how some of the songs and sounds and experiences might not have been that different, in the sense that there's this poor white working class group of people making one type of music, and there's a kind of similarity in that. But there's a social element to which those people are being essentially told to hate, put down, disparage, lynch the other group of people making that kind of music. There has to be a tension there, surely, that there was still a hierarchy was being imposed on a group of people there. And it's sort of odd to think about them as although they are contemporaneous and although they have shared elements, I just find it difficult to think about those kinds of songs.
I think you're thinking about it slightly too hard. I mean, I think you've got two separate things. You have the massive racist structures of the South, particularly, unequivocally, there's absolutely no doubt about that, which doesn't preclude individual experiences.
Yeah.
Sure. No,
this is true. And I wish I could tell you how many white musicians I've met who have expressed great and warm, perceptive feelings about black music, and sometimes specific black musicians, have acknowledged that it played an important, sometimes a formative part in their own music making. And once or twice I said, when they said, there was this guy that used to play around the corner and we would go and listen to him. And I said, did you ever have him around the house? And there was a long pause, and I would be asked, why on earth would I do a thing like that? And so, I mean, these are commonplace experiences. Anybody that's spent any time talking to people in the South will be able to duplicate them. But yes, it was possible. This is one of the most insidious aspects of racism. It is possible to have, as Marx says, individual admiration and collective scorn. And they live together in the same person.
Yeah. Just found it really interesting. I mean, recently having watched Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, which is a new film about Ma Rainey and set in 1927 in Chicago, just because it's at the same time, and that's a very, very powerful film, I think. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but it is a very difficult topic to untangle in all of this.
Yes, it does tackle that issue of racism in the music business more explicitly than most musical biopics, so to speak, have done in the past.
All the boys in the neighborhood, they say your black bottoms are really good. Come on and show me your black bottoms. I want to learn that dance.
I did want to just mention the third piece that we're going to run, which is this excellent piece you wrote about B.B. King for Cream magazine, not the American Cream, but British Cream with an A, in 1972, which is, I think it's titled something like Will Success Spoil...
Yes, that's right. Will Success Spoil B.B. King, yes.
Will Success Spoil B.B. King. It's just a very thoughtful piece about...
One of those questions expecting the answer no, as they used to say in the Latin grammars. Yes.
But, I mean, you did write, you were one of those bylines that when I was sort of starting to read things like Let It Rock in the 70s, and having read, Charlie Gillett's Sound of the City and so forth, you were one of the people who was writing authoritatively and interestingly about B.B. King and co. And I just wondered how you remember that time, and whether you felt part of a kind of small group of writers who were writing about roots music in that era.
So far as writing about blues and yes, I mean, Cream was an interesting magazine because it gathered an extraordinary cast of writers, Simon Frith, Dave Lang, Charles Shaw Murray, I mean, all sorts of people got their start or got a boot up the ladder through that magazine, even though it only lasted about 2.5 years, I think. Yes, I mean, well, as with any group of music writers, there was rivalry and backbiting and, scorn behind the hand and all that stuff. But,
I do hope
but
so.
A certain amount of comedy as well, I think. But there weren't a lot of people that were just interested in blues. Like me. Well, I wasn't just interested in blues, but that was what I was just interested in writing about in the context of a rock magazine.
But you never wrote about Barclay James Harvest. Let's just say that. State that for the record. And there was a kind of purism about your approach.
No, actually, that's not entirely true, because one of the things that I don't know if it was Bob Houston as the editor of Cream or Charlie Gillett as the reviews editor. One of the things that whoever it was did was occasionally give records to people that weren't the obvious reviewers for them. And I remember in one quite long review, I covered both Carole King's Tapestry and Joni Mitchell's Blue and several others. So, I mean, I did step out of my ground, as you might say, from time to time, partly because, if you wanted to make any kind of a living as a music writer back then, you had to be more versatile than just writing articles about B.B. King. And it was, one felt that one was kind of exercising one's journalistic muscles anyway, writing about stuff that didn't fall neatly into the in tray marked, this stuff already.
But what I think is exceptional about the B.B. King piece is how clear-eyed you are. It feels very contemporary and very current. The things that you're talking about in the B.B. King piece, the race makeup of his audience, the way previous careers have gone in the blues, and how you kind of work the white fan, black singer angle is incredibly well-balanced and
I'm
well
glad,
thought out.
I'm glad if that comes through. I think it's not so much down to the writer as down to the subject. B.B. King was just exceptional in that he was somebody of whom you could ask questions like that. I mean, who'd thought about things like that himself. A lot of the blues singers that I'd met were not people who thought long and hard about what they were doing and how to cope with different audiences. I don't mean they were completely without any notion of the fact that it was different to play at the Royal Albert Hall in the Folk Blues Festival from playing in a Chicago club. But B.B. had been doing so much traveling in so many places for so long that he was a very sophisticated and aware person, and so it was possible to ask questions that ranged a little further perhaps than the questions one asked about blues artists, because he was so much larger in a sense than they were.
But it's very interesting, your piece where you kind of you make the reference to, does he occupy the same place as Armstrong, and the kind of edging towards a kind of Uncle Tom kind of thing. You're very interesting about that. I thought that was
always a danger that the white society generally has room for one black superstar in music, and for years it was Louis. And then as he got a little tainted by the whole, handkerchief and hello Dolly kind of persona, then
Ray Charles had been,
and Ray Charles likewise. But then I think it was partly when Playboy started to pick up on B.B. King, and he started appearing in full color advertisements in American magazines. That's the point at which he is clearly, the Louis Armstrong de nos jours.
Yeah.
I don't know who's taken his place. It's interesting. People ask sometimes, who's the greatest living blues man, which isn't quite the same question. It's probably now, I suppose, Buddy Guy, but he doesn't have that reach into white musical appreciation.
Robert Cray, but not a big enough audience.
No.
But then it's also because the blues is so distant now. I mean, B.B. King was still having hits. The Thriller's Gone was a huge hit. So he was having popular hits. He wasn't just an old guy, and Bill Graham was booking him into the Fillmores and all that sort of stuff was going on. So we weren't looking at B.B. as something from the past, I don't think.
No. And neither, importantly, was he. I mean, Buddy Guy and Junior Wells could have been bigger even than they were, but they seemed content to just go on doing roughly the same sort of thing that they always did. Whereas B.B., either through his own ambition or possibly at some managerial suggestion from time to time, had a very open and capacious attitude towards his own future. He would try any number of things, and not just to stay on top, but because I think he liked challenging himself or being challenged.
Yeah.
And that's quite rare amongst blues musicians, I think.
Thrill is gone. The thrill is gone away. The thrill is gone, baby. The thrill is gone away.
With your blessing, Tony, I'd like to move the discussion on to two artists who, in a sense, kind of followed in the wake of old-time country music. Mark's already mentioned the Everly Brothers, but I'd like to just talk briefly about Gillian Welch, who has a new album out. In fact, it's the first album, I think, attributed to Gillian Welch and David Rawlings. I'm a huge fan. I know Martin and I think Mark are both fans. I mean, just for the record, what's your take on someone like Gillian Welch, who's clearly steeped in all the music we've been talking about?
Oh, well, I absolutely approve of her, not that it matters down to her. And I think David Rawlings is one of the most exquisite accompanists and harmony singers in Americana music, whatever you want to call it. No, I have nothing but admiration for Gillian Welch.
Well, that's good to know, because they need to pass the Tony Russell test. I mean, Martin, I think you were the first person who mentioned Gillian Welch to me. In fact, I was listening back to the audio interview I did with Gillian and David when that first album came out, and I hear myself saying, a friend of mine in London saw you at the Purcell Room. I think that was you. Did you see them at the Purcell Room? So you had told me how brilliant she was. I really think you think with the. I mean, what was did you hear Revival when it first came out?
No, I heard it because Mark told me about it.
Oh, it's Mark, right.
Well, I went to see her very first London show, which was a record company junket in, I think, Soho House or one of those Soho clubs.
Soho House?
No, it's one of the fancy Soho
Babington House.
private clubs. It's one of the private clubs.
Really? Okay.
And our friend Tom Fenner, Micro Disney's drummer, took me along because he was then just starting his career as a T-boy at BBC Radio, and I got a freebie. I'd never heard of these people. Went up these stairs, and after a couple of drinks, and there was just a room full of music business people. And there's a little stage, and her and David went up on the stage and started doing their stuff. And I was just flabbergasted. It was like, whoa, this is good. They were handing out the CDs before it had been released. They were handing the CDs out at the door, so I kind of grabbed one, went home and played it, and just completely fell in love with it. Probably babbled to poor old Martin about it.
You were on the phone to Martin within minutes.
I went to the Purcell Room where I saw these two people who looked just like Bonnie and Clyde. And they kind of...
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, and they were fantastic. Interesting. I've listened to some of the recent stuff, and I don't know whether they're just slightly repeating themselves now.
It's not as good, is it?
Well,
it's not as good.
It's just not as fresh, and I wonder how people. I suppose this is a general question: how people's careers move, without being a changeling, or if you're working in a certain area that is a relatively narrow area, then either like B.B. King, you do country albums, you work with the Crusaders, you do a bit of jazzier stuff. I feel slightly that they're in a kind of a rut. Yes.
I mean, it's challenging with a kind of Americana that is somehow backward looking. Where do you take
it's
that?
Old-timey.
It's old-timey.
It's old-timey, isn't it?
I mean, that doesn't stop me appreciating how amazing a guitar player David Rawlings is.
No, of course. I mean,
one of the things that made me slightly fed up with him, actually fairly rapidly, was a song on the very first album called Flat Black Ford, which involved a sort of fairly grungy electric guitar part and things like that. And I like the tension between them using sort of a more modern sonic palette and the old-timey sort of acoustic guitar and lap steel and so on and so forth. And that seemed to drop out of their repertoire. They didn't pursue that.
Well, I think T-Bone Burnett actively encouraged them to go for a little bit more variety on that first record.
Yeah, I like David Rawlings' drumming, actually. It's like the rich manual of
Sure.
He's a very good electric guitar player as well.
Yes.
Then
maybe they need to do a full band record. That would be the
Well, they did do Soul Journey's got some bandish stuff. I went for a walk before we started recording, and I played a couple of tracks from Revival. One More Dollar. Is that not just one of the perfect things ever recorded by anybody? It's just immaculate. And then the track that's closest to the old time sound that we've been talking about, I think it's probably By the Mark. Is so traditional. It could almost have been recorded in sort of 1927. It's fantastic. I love them. We're running a Mark Cooper piece, which is really, really good, in which Gillian, she's a similar epiphany to yours, Tony, when you first heard Charlie Poole. And she claimed that she was scrubbing her bathroom floor when a friend put on a Stanley Brothers album, and it was like a light bulb going off in my head. So she's probably always, in some Proustian way, always associating cleaning her bathroom with bluegrass music. But she says something interesting at the end, and they both said this, and I think they even made, one of them said it to me, which is they think of their music as art, really. It's an art form. We're not throwbacks. She says to Mark Cooper, the vocabulary stays within the tradition, but this is art. We're not throwbacks, and we're not just being literal. You don't have to believe in heaven or to be a farmer to be moved by this sound. And I think that's really good, because they have had a lot of flack for being like middle-class music graduates. And at the end of the day, I don't give a shit where they went to school or where they grew up. Their music, particularly the first 2 albums, it just speaks to me emotionally. It just absolutely gets me. And, love them.
I think it's a phrase I use in a slightly different context in my new book, Rural Rhythm, is that imaginatively true. It's not that the thing is exactly what you might, at a first glance, take it to be, or what it appears to be imitating. It's, in a sense, false. If that's how you're approaching it, it's not the real thing, but it's imaginatively the real thing, and that elides the barrier between the real and the feigned.
Well, so they have a new album called All the Good Times Are Past Gone. I think it's just out tomorrow. But why don't we talk about another act that clearly came out of this tradition? If we think of close harmony, a high lonesome close harmony singing as being absolutely kind of endemic to old time country music. There are many who would argue, I'd probably agree with them, that Don and Phil Everly were the greatest harmony singers ever. And so, Mark, would you tell us a little bit about the Everly?
Yes.
It's Phil Everly, isn't it?
Yeah, it's John Tobler in 1983, the less interesting Everly brother, Phil. And which he talks about.
Ouch.
he talks about his solo album just done in London, produced by Stuart Coleman, which included players like our friend and one of our writers, Pete Wingfield, who produced some tracks for Martin and I back in the day. Unfortunately, also Mark Knopfler. There's a fly in every ointment. But he does talk about. We'll listen to the clip. They're finally, after 10 years of barely talking to one another, there's talk of an Everly Brothers reunion. So let's have a listen to this first clip.
How did you mesh together again?
Well, we haven't quite meshed in that sense that I haven't seen Donald. I've only talked to Don on the phone, several times, and it's got its own. Don and I's. It's really what you're seeing is sort of a public view of two brothers, and with anyone with any brothers or sisters, everybody knows your brother knows you better than anybody in the world, whether you've seen him or not, and as it's got to have a flow of its own, and but I think the basic important thing is that we both wish to settle that up. I think people would be very keen and very happy and I think it would be very important for us personally. I don't want to end my life on negative terms with my brother.
We used to have good us together, but now I feel them slip away.
Well, that didn't work. Interesting enough, he's talking about how they're going to put the band together, because at that stage, Don had a band, Phil had a band. Now, in Don's band was Albert Lee, and Phil's band was Pete Wingfield, at least certainly recording-wise. And what they did was they put them together, and Pete invited me along to the Albert Hall to see one of their Albert Hall shows. It was a good show, great playing. You know, Albert Lee's a fantastic guitar player, and so on. Pete's very funny. He said, separate planes, separate hotel rooms, separate cars, separate dressing rooms. They would not address a single word to one another off stage. And they hated other guys. And what was absolutely brilliant was one of those BBC series like Rock and Roll USA, one of those multi-part sort of... Don's interviewed in it. And he says, well, the difference between Phil and I, Phil's right wing. And I'm for the worker. I'm a socialist. You know, it's extraordinary. You know that they have this massive political schism. He says, you know, I'm for the working man, for the union. You know, and it was just great, great. Which of course made me love Don Everly all the more. You know. Anyway, so you know, he goes on about that sort of. Tobler asks him about the failure of the last handful of Everlys albums. So let's have a listen to that clip. The decline of the Everlys.
Bye-bye love, bye-bye happiness, hello loneliness, I think I'm gonna cry.
Were you conscious that the Everly Brothers records towards the end of, in the late 60s and early 70s were getting less interesting to the public?
Well, of course, we were aware, but being in that sort of, being as we were, looking back on it, you wind up in a matter of, it was getting more divisive. We had separate managers towards the end. We had a lot of separate things, and there was too many elements involved. And this is either a process I think we're able to handle a little better now, but then it was really a divisive kind of circumstances going on, and I think that contributed a lot. Like Pass the Chicken and Listen album, the selection of materials, it wasn't as jointly decided on. It was more like okay, rather than yes, And I think that is, it's like anything. You can't do anything without your full attention and expect it to be of the same kind of quality.
Bye-bye love, bye-bye sweet caress, hello emptiness, I feel like I could die. Bye-bye, my love, goodbye.
I still think Pass the Chicken and Listen is a great album title.
It's fantastic. It's fantastic. So there we have it. We'll play a clip at the end of the podcast. He talks about his two favourite Everly Brothers songs, which will not surprise any of you when you listen to it.
Leave the audience in suspense.
Leave the audience in suspense.
Stay tuned, folks.
Tony, I mean, Everly Brothers fan, I have to assume?
I wasn't at the time particularly, and I admire them in a way for the music that they based themselves on, which was predominantly the Louvin brothers.
Yeah.
And I think, you might get into some interesting fistfights in parts of the South if you advance your Everly Brothers, the best harmony act of all time.
Of course.
In a bar room full of Louvinites.
I've never floated that theory below the next Mason-Dixon line.
Like a lot of things about this music, sometimes it's the stuff around the actual music itself which is in a way even more interesting. And that's kind of how I feel about the Everlys. I mean, their father, Ike Everly, and his interaction with other guitarists in that style, and especially the black musician that Mark mentioned, Arnold Schultz, I think is who he meant. There's a fascinating social situation of black-white interchange, which I think actually did have people all sitting in the same room admiring each other and playing for each other, something that wouldn't have been possible a generation earlier.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, so that's the Everlys, and I think it's time now for a very sort of, quite an abrupt change of tack. We're saying goodbye to two major musical figures this week, and one of them is Bunny Wailer, one of the three original Wailers who passed away earlier in the week. So we're running a couple of pieces about Bunny, inevitably a great piece by Vivian Goldman when the first solo album, Black Heart Man, comes out. And we're also running a piece from Vibe 1995 about what happened to the Wailers' catalogue after Marley's death and the complete chaos of all that.
God,
but
yeah.
Mark, I just want to ask you whether you remember Black Heart Man coming out and, you know, what that record means to you and what Bunny Wailer means to you, as opposed to, say, Bob Marley and the Wailers.
Well, I mean, I suppose that's slightly problematic because by the time he started releasing his own stuff, and Black Heart Man in particular, that was an area of reggae I was moving away from. I was getting more and more into dub, the much more instrumental sort of side of stuff. I always loved his voice. Richard Williams in his
blog post, yeah,
exactly, pointed out a wonderful song where he takes the lead, and in the Wailers in the 60s, absolutely kind of channeling Curtis Mayfield and beautifully. He had a lovely voice, by all counts, a really, really lovely man as well, which you couldn't necessarily say about his colleague Peter Tosh. I remember there was a very good documentary about West Indian cricket, and he features quite heavily sort of singing the praises of Michael Holding and so on and so forth. But was I fanatical about his solo output? Not really. I didn't really chase after it that much, to be honest.
I do think Black Heart Man is a pretty great record.
It's a lovely record.
You know, I mean, I revisited it this week, and it's very slow. It's interestingly very slow, isn't it? We also added, I haven't put this on the homepage, but Rob Partridge's Melody Maker review of that album when it came out, which is very, very positive. Yeah. But Bunny says some interesting things to Vivian in this piece, and he talks about what the Black Heart Man means and just how he, as a young man, grew up thinking that Rastafarians would somehow quite sort of threatening and dangerous, and you needed to be quite wary of them. And then gradually you begin to realize that their mode of life perhaps makes more sense than the way life is kind of steering you in the 70s. And it's a really good piece, actually. And yeah, love Bunny Wailer, love the early Wailers stuff, and the first sort of two albums on. I mean, interestingly, somewhere maybe in Larry Jaffe's piece from Vibe, Chris Blackwell said at the time that Black Heart Man was the best album to come out of Jamaica.
It's Vivian Goldman's piece.
It's Vivian Goldman's piece.
I found that really interesting as a thing to say. And Vivian Goldman says he was right at the time, you know, and I think that's fascinating. I think, as you say, the sound of his voice is just wonderful.
Yeah, yeah.
I'll play your favorite song, darling, so we can rock it all night long, darling, 'cause I've got love, darling.
But we're also saying goodbye to Chris Barber, which ties in with some of the things we started out with, Tony. I mean, you can't have, I mean, this guy is a massive figure in the story of how blues and rhythm and blues took root here. I mean, Tony, would you care to just give us some context on Chris Barber in terms of your fandom?
Yes, I didn't know it. I didn't really fully take this on board at the time. I think a lot of us didn't, because Chris, having done what he did, was then off doing other things. But in the late 50s and early 60s, he single-handedly really got American blues artists over to Britain. Famously, Muddy Waters in 1958. I think James Cotton.
Sonny Terry and Brownie.
Sonny and Brownie, of course, yes.
Yeah.
And by the time I was interested, which was half a dozen years later, this sort of thing was more commonplace. And it was, who's coming this year? Oh, Sonny and Brownie. Oh, yeah.
Sure.
Right.
You're getting a bit blasé.
Yes. But Chris was operating in a pre-blues era, in a sense. I mean, this is before blues fanzines, before there were, blues series on record labels. He was one of a small band of probably originally record collectors. George Melly has some fine anecdotes about Chris Barber as a meticulous record collector with his 78s all, neatly lined up on shelves. And that's how he would have learned about blues, I think.
Well, I have to ask Martin about Chris Barber, of course,
absolutely,
because his uncle was in a band with Chris Barber.
Well, yes, but in fact, interestingly, I found a cassette of my dad used to do record recitals, because pre the radio playing any of this stuff, he would go to jazz clubs in places like Dorset and talk people through records. And one of them, it was a great tape, and it ends with Rabbit Brown's James Alley Blues, which I knew from the anthology. But funny to think that Bill was playing these records in 19 50s Dorset to people who would come out to listen to records.
Yes.
But Bill and Chris put together Ken's band for when Ken came back from his New Orleans adventure from jail, was deported on the Queen Mary, sent home. Yes, and of course that led on to Lonnie and Alexis Corner being part of the band. But Chris was a mover. He had great ears, loved New Orleans. I loved the fact that he continued his love with post-jazz New Orleans music. Yeah. He toured with Dr. John a lot. He had a very close relationship with him. Lovely guy. In fact, once I kind of was talking to Chris, and I sort of apologised for my dad. Because at one point, Bill, the band that Chris had put together, had my old friend Ron Bowden on drums, and Bill decided that they should fire the rhythm section because they were too modern. And so Chris went off with the rhythm section. They talked, and they came back and fired Ken. So and I said, I think it was. I'd like to apologise for Bill doing that. He said, we were all so young and stupid. Yes. He said. I don't know why we all felt so passionately about all this, but of course that was what made them great. They were totally passionate.
Young people do. Yeah.
My one very brief Chris Barber thing is I went to the Capital Jazz Festival in 1981. It was outside Alexandra Palace, and it was Muddy Waters was closing the Saturday night, and it was terrible at first. Bob Margolin's guitar player was bitching at the monitor mixer guy, and nothing was happening. Muddy was stuck in his stool; he wasn't doing anything. Suddenly it clicked, and Muddy got off his stool and started doing that little chicken dance that he used to do, and then Chris Barber came out and blew trombone on Manish Boy, and it was just electrifying. It was a fantastic show.
Yeah. Well, we're running two pieces. One is with the aforementioned Max Jones from 1965, which is just Chris talking. But there's a piece that the late John Pidgeon wrote specifically for us in 2009, which is really a fantastic piece. On rereading it, I've forgotten how brilliant it was, called Father of British R&B. And it really does make the case very strongly for how important he was. That, not only did he bring Bill Brunsey over, he brought Muddy Waters over here. And then he and his wife, Ottilie Patterson, went to Chicago. And Ottilie, who was white, ended up getting up on stage at Smitty's Corner in Chicago with Muddy's band. I mean, and this must have been 19... I'm taking a guess here because John doesn't specify the date. But I mean, I'm guessing it's 57, 58, something like that. Maybe later.
I
mean,
pioneer.
Without Chris Barber and, well, indeed, without without the Collier family. I mean, we may, who knows where all this would have gone? Would there have been Alexis Corner and the Rolling Stones? Would they have done what they ended up doing without Chris Barber? Possibly not.
Possibly not. And possibly not. I mean, much as Lonnie has his detractors, I think without his sense of showbiz or his way of selling a song, then the skiffle thing would never have happened as big as it did, and affect everyone of that generation.
Yeah.
Jimmy Page to
completely.
Mick and
completely.
Keith.
Yeah, it's a final kind of lineage to follow through.
Mama, they treat your daughter mean. Oh, Mama, they treat your daughter mean. He's the meanest man that I've ever seen.
I think we've come to the point where we need to hear about some of the pieces, Mark, that have been added over the last fortnight.
Yes.
Briefly.
Yes. Okay, just right. Well, last week I chucked in talking about Max Jones, his interview with Ben Webster from Melody Maker 1965. Was 1965, Martin, was that the time Ben Webster slept on your couch?
I think it might have been. Breakfast with Ben.
And he's talking about working at Ronnie Scott's. He says, every night I go to work, the trio plays better. That Stan Tracy's a bitch. He's full of surprises, pleasant surprises, which I love that.
Great.
Peter Green, Beats Instrumental 1966, interviewed by Kevin Swift. This is 66, just joined the Blues Breakers. He says, I just people would stop comparing me with Eric. I just like them to accept me as Pete Green, not Clapton's replacement. We got a very nice, I won't quote from it, but a very nice review of Curtis Mayfield live in San Francisco in 1971 by Philip Elwood from the San Francisco Examiner. In 1990, John Morthland does a big piece on Rocky Erickson, How do you pronounce it?
Rocky.
Barney's?
Yeah, Rocky's
Rocky.
correct. I know it's weird. You'd think there should be a C there, but
yeah,
it's still Rocky.
And it's just great. He says, in the house, he keeps a Roland amp at a steady hum, over which half-dozen radios and TVs and a police scanner all play at once, providing ambient noise. When Rocky wants to watch a video, usually horror movies, or listen to music, almost always on 8-track tape, he simply jacks the volume up on that particular machine. He is, as he puts it, just kicked back and relaxing, having some fun out there. Right, this week going in, very interesting, Derek Taylor, writing for Disc and Music Echo, leaps to the defense of the recently busted Rolling Stones. This is in July 1967. And he does it in the most kind of elaborate sort of way. He says, we still fear so many other things, stupid things like parental disapproval, neighbour snubs, the jeers of the typing pool. We still have the horrors if anyone pierces the morning mask. We still take our faces out of the jar by the door. Little quote he gets in there. It's time for everyone to speak for himself. It's purple prose in defence of the Rolling Stones and their drug taking.
What a surprise that Derek would take that tack.
The recently departed Chick Corea, on working with Miles Davis to John Swenson, Zoo World 1974, he said, I found it fascinating, exciting, boring, angry, very serene, enthusiastic, a drag, frustrating. So that's Chick Corea.
That covers the whole gamut.
Quite a good way of
Mixed review.
Morris Day, interviewed by Don Waller in LA Weekly in 1984, says, my grandfather used to dress like I do, baggies, double-breasted suits, wide lapels and everything. I love that, him talking about his grandfather basically being a zoot suit wearing dude.
Zoot suits, yeah.
And lastly, Amy Linden reviews a big R&B show at Madison Square Garden, headlined by the likes of LL Cool J and so on. And she says, the simulated sex never stopped. Guys were thrusting their pelvises at everything, from lighting cables to stage monitors. Was this a hot night on Times Square? No, it's the Coca-Cola Summerfest show, Thursday at the Garden, headlined by LL Cool J and Naughty by Nature. You can just see it, can't you? I mean, it's great. So that's my lot. Was that fast enough, Jasper?
Super compressed.
Tremendous.
Super good. It was like bluegrass speeding up old-time country music. I'll mention just 3 things very, very quickly, even quicker. Our old friend Candy, a Crazy Horse, who was a recent guest on the podcast, a splendid piece from 2009, apropos of Jonathan Wilson's Gentle Spirit album. But it's basically just Candy riffing about sort of Laurel Canyon and everything that California means to her in a way that only she could write. It's fantastic. There's quite a fun interview with Dave Edmunds from 2015 by Carl Weiser of Song Facts. I learned just a few things about Dave and Rock and Nick Lowe from that amused me. And lastly, a piece about Valerie June by Jeffrey Himes from 2017. And I really only mention this because it prompted me to listen to Valerie June, who I hadn't really listened to before. And she's really great.
Really good.
She's really good. Oh my God.
Yeah.
I mean, so it's so nice to have just I can't really describe what she does. Can you, Jasper? It's such a weird melting
Put me
pot
on the spot
stuff.
there. It is a really interesting.
It's quite Appalachian,
right.
but it's also
She's got a bit of high lonesome, but also with some kind of undercurrent of
bit of gospel.
Yes,
it's
bit of blues.
She is interesting.
Bit of soul.
She's a black Southerner who's clearly who's listened to the music we've been talking about in this episode, and yet it feels so unique. Yeah. Have you heard her, Tony, at all? Valerie June?
Yes, I've seen her perform.
Have you?
I'm not really convinced. No,
okay.
Everything you say is true and relevant, but it also means that, there's a bit of this and a bit of this, and has she got some of the other? That the music seems to me to be a little unanchored.
Okay.
Unlike, say, Gillian Welch and David Rawlings. So it's looking for a home for me still.
Huh.
But maybe that's part of the sort of excitement
for a lot of people, that would be the charm of it.
Yeah. She's sort of roaming through this landscape.
Been pushing my way up against the stone, and I believe to my soul, time to move on.
Jasper, how about your good self?
I'll also just mention a couple of things very quickly. The first of which, just for the sake of lowering the tone, which I love to do. Although actually the article itself doesn't lower the tone, just the quote I'm going to read from
It's
it.
just you lowering
It's just
the
me.
tone.
It's our first article about Sway. It's a record review of, he's a rapper, grime artist, mid-noughties. Pete Perfides reviews This Is My Demo by Sway in the Times. And I went and listened to it, and it's actually a really good record. And he's very funny, Sway. That's what Pete Perfides agrees with. He's laugh out loud funny too, always the best way to make a serious point. Hence on Hype Boys, when drawing a line in the sand between his own interior world and that of the gangster, these rappers couldn't see me coming, even if they were vaginas with spectacles.
God,
which is
the tone duly lowered.
Which I just think is one of the most hilarious lyrics I've ever heard. I think it's just I don't know.
That's
where
a
that
lyric,
came
is
from,
it? That's a lyric.
Yeah, it's a lyric. It's a lyric. I just think. And when you hear it,
That's
it's
so
completely convincing as well. It's fun.
So that takes our rating out of PG into triple X rated.
Yeah. The other thing is a lengthy piece that's really nice by Alan Light in Relics, which is about Brian Burton, aka Danger Mouse, and his fascination with spaghetti western music. And he made this album Rome with Daniele Luppi, Jack White, and Nora Jones, which is his kind of inspired by spaghetti western soundtracks. First came another quest for the original musicians and the vintage gear on which they'd recorded those landmark soundtracks. In perfect Italian style, some of the equipment rental would be paid for with bottles of wine. The musicians hadn't worked together for years. When they first got to the studio, there were laughter, tears, hugging. Within a few hours, of course, they were screaming and yelling, which I guess was back to their normal state, says Burton. But it's great because if you listen to the Gnarls Barkley record Crazy, it samples the soundtrack of a spaghetti western. And part of its genius is doing that in a totally incongruous context, which I think is fascinating. And I think the piece is well worth a look for that reason, because he clearly does love spaghetti westerns, which is a sort of funny thing for a very cutting edge producer of pop music of the last 20 years to be fascinated.
And
by.
he got in a bona fide Italian to be part of this. Daniele Di Luca.
Yes.
I don't know who that is. You pronounced his name so beautifully. It was like listening to a sort of to a Puccini aria or something.
Wow, I'll take that. He's a frequent collaborator, I think, of his, and
Is
they both
he? Okay.
had shared this fascination for the spaghetti western stuff. So that's my couple of things.
Excellent,
brilliant, lovely stuff. Well, I mean, gentlemen, I think we are out of time. It remains for me to thank Tony. Thank you so much for joining us today. And please, listeners, do rush out and buy or download onto your Kindle, but you really need this in hardcovers. Rural Rhythm, the story of old-time country music in 78 records, published by Oxford University Press. And you should also, of course, read all of Tony's other books, including the definitive Penguin Guide to Blues Recordings from 2006. So it's been a real privilege to have you here, Tony. Good luck with the book and everything else.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Thanks
Mark,
very much.
if you would just talk us out with the final Phil Everly clip.
Yes, it's the lesser spotted Everly talking about his favourite Everly Brothers songs.
Right, so there's your suspense is an end, folks. So goodbye to everyone. We'll be back in 2 weeks with Adele Berthe of the Bloods and former Contortion, talking about LaBelle and Peter Loeffner, if that's how you pronounce his name. We'll look forward to seeing you then. But meanwhile, it's good night from them. And it's good night from me. So,
Good night.
Thanks very
bye,
much.
everyone.
What's your favourite song that you sang with your brother?
I think, without a doubt, I can answer it very quickly. It's still "Let It Be Me" is still my favorite. Although, All I Have to Do Is Dream is and I hate to say "Let It Be Me," but when Boudleaux Bryant wrote almost all those hits for us, but it really runs between. I still think "Let It Be Me," and then a very small point behind is "All I Have to Do Is Dream."
I bless the day I found you. I want to stay around you, and so I beg you, let it be me.
That was Phil Everly in conversation with John Tobler in 1983, concluding this week's Rock's Back Pages podcast. Many thanks to special guest Tony Russell. Rural Rhythm is published by OUP and available now from all good bookshops. The hosts were Barney Hoskins, Mark Pringle and Martin Collier, and it was co-hosted and produced by Jasper Murison Bowie. The Rock's Back Pages podcast is part of the Pantheon Podcast Network. You can find thousands of articles, as well as hundreds of full-length audio interviews at rocksbackpages.com.
Thank you.